the WCPA president until about 1 o'clock today. Then I turned it over to Quincy. On my home campus of UW-Madison, I serve as the Assistant Dean and Director of the Office of Student Conduct and Community Standards. We're so thrilled that you have joined us for our first ever completely virtual conference. We are glad that you are joining over 300 student affairs staff, faculty, and students who have registered to experience 2 days of learning from talented presenters, an opportunity to connect with old and new colleagues, a chance to celebrate some of the accomplishments of our colleagues and the outstanding programs that have been done. And hopefully you will join us for trivia tonight so you can have some belly laughs with us. We will embark on one of my favorite aspects of WCPA on Saturday when we host Student Affairs 101 for students interested in exploring more in depth the different areas of student affairs. They'll get a chance to learn about graduate programs they may want to attend and also get some tips to spruce up their resume and get ready for this adventure. So with that, I encourage all of you to be engaged throughout the next couple of days. Comment in the chat. People are already doing that. That's wonderful. Ask questions of the presenters, engage in dialogue. It's really easy to sit back and kind of just listen, but the more engaged, I think, the better. Make connections. That's what this conference is all about. It's a little more difficult when we are in a virtual setting, but you'll just need to exchange your business card by typing your email in the chat. So we realize everyone cannot be at every single session. We totally understand that. I hope you'll jump in and out as you can. But when you are there in those sessions, please be present and participatory. And I love, again, that everyone has their screen on for the most part, if they can, obviously. It will just make the experience a lot more richer for both presenters and attendees. So now I'd like to invite you to sit back, get ready to engage with our wonderful keynote speaker. It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Howard Schweber. Dr. Schweber has been a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison since the fall of 1999. He received his PhD in government from Cornell University and an MA in history from the University of Chicago, after spending 5 years practicing law in Seattle and San Francisco. Dr. Schweber teaches courses focusing on constitutional law and legal and political theory. He is the author of Democracy and Authenticity, The Language of Liberal Constitutionalism, The Creation of American Common Law, and Speech, Conduct, and the First Amendment, as well as many articles, essays, and book chapters on a variety of related topics. His current areas of research include comparative constitutional law and democratic theories of representation. In addition to his position in the Poli-Sci department, Dr. Schweber is a core faculty member of the Legal Studies program. From 2011 to 2013, he was visiting professor and the first Vice Provost for Academic Affairs at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. And in 2012, he was the Australian Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Politics. Dr. Schweber is a regular guest on Wisconsin radio and gives frequent newspaper, radio, and television interviews in the local, national, and international press. He is also a contributing blogger at HuffingtonPost.com and an occasional guest blogger on other sites, and a frequent public speaker both on and off campus. Dr. Schweber was previously the faculty advisor and coach for the UW mock trial team and is currently the advisor for Sifting and Winnowing, Wisconsin's undergraduate politics and law journal. I personally got to hear Dr. Schweber speak for the first time on the topic of free speech and college campuses in the fall of 2018. His approach to this often misunderstood topic is interesting and engaging, and I believe it is more important than ever for us to engage our campus communities on the topic of free speech and the First Amendment. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Schweber to the 2020 virtual WCPA annual conference. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me, and good morning to everyone. I love this audience because this is looking under the hood. You're the people who make the university actually run. and actually deal with questions like student discipline, free speech limits, controversies that will arise on the ground as they happen. Having worked in university administration and been directly involved in, among other things, writing a student code of conduct, I'm very aware of the issues and problems that can arise and how difficult it can be. I'd like to be able to simply have a nice chat about general principles, but the fact is it's unavoidable in dealing with this topic that we have to grind through a little bit of legal stuff because there are legal principles involved. And while it's not necessary to be an expert, it's absolutely necessary to have a broad understanding of the contours within which one is working. I believe there's an outline that's been posted on the chat. I'm going to be following that outline, and you might find it helpful to do the same. If not, it may be available later. So let me start by pointing out, as again, you all are much more aware than I am, some of the ways in which situations involving free speech claims on particularly public campuses arise these days. And one is just lawsuits. There are lots of lawsuits. Organizations like FIRE are busily engaged in suing colleges and universities to try and get them to comport with the desired standard of free speech. There are also staged provocations. I don't know how before the era of the internet we ever got along without the word trolling, but trolling has become such a part of our experience of the public realm, especially the political public realm, that it needs to be acknowledged as a phenomenon of its own. And in fact, online trolling is an area of First Amendment law that courts are wrestling with right now. I'm not really going to get into that today unless people have questions about it, but it's one of those unexplored and undeveloped areas where there's clearly a need for some new rules. We're also living in a time where there are highly sensitized communities. Our communities of color, among students, faculty, and staff in particular, we are all living through a highly sensitized moment in American racial politics. But for persons who are members of community of color or the LGBTQ community or immigrants, these are particularly challenging times, to put it, or threatening times, if you like. And that means that people are more concerned than ever with the way they're speaking to one another. Conversely, on the other end of the political spectrum, there's also a massive sensitization to what's perceived as political correctness or elite attitudes. Everyone is extremely quick to take offense and perceive themselves to be victimized. Part of that is the political polarization and militancy that we're seeing as an aspect of the Trump administration years. In the last, it really goes back farther. This started during the Obama administration, but in addition to everything else, we're living through a period of political polarization and radicalism on both the left and the right, as it says next on the outline, that we have not seen in mainstream American politics since about the 1930s, if I had to choose a period. It's certainly been a long time. And then there's COVID. Aside from the fact that we're holding this meeting online, COVID involves all kinds of interventions by government authorities that are thought to be necessary by those who support them and are thought to be infringements on freedom by those who oppose them. And so, for example, just this morning, I got an email from someone asking me to respond to a student who was complaining that being forced to wear a mask was a violation of his free speech rights, which I responded, that's absolute nonsense. But the fact is, those arguments are being made. And it's the kind of argument that, again, people who are on the ground, like you all, who deal with this stuff on a daily experiential basis, need to be able to respond to without having to go and look it up. And so that's what I'm going to try and present today. An approach to thinking about these questions, how to conceptualize the relationship between academic freedom and free speech on college campuses, how to think legally, that is, what are the actual legal rules, because it's important to have at least a basic understanding of those rules available and easily referential, and then strategically, whether you're involved in drafting a code of conduct or implementing a code of conduct or overseeing a student hearing or just dealing with complaints about the process or the content of college rules, what are strategic ways of approaching those problems to minimize future problems, difficulties? So let's start with the conceptualization. And my main point, and the one that gets lost most often, is that free speech and academic freedom are in fact opposing values. That might sound like a very odd thought. We tend to think of them as coextensional, but in fact they are opposite. What do I mean by that? Well, academic freedom in its formally recognized, that is legally recognized sense, is an institutional right. And this is also its historical meaning. It's the freedom of the institution from intervention by the state. So if the Wisconsin legislature says all the campuses of UW must teach creationism, that would be an infringement on academic freedom. On the other hand, if a particular biology department at a University of Wisconsin campus decides to teach creationism, that's an exercise of academic freedom. That is the institution's ability to control standards of grading, curriculum design, departmental organization, and hiring are all exercises of academic freedom. So to flip the example around, it is not a violation of academic freedom for a geology department to decline to hire someone who wants to teach that the young Earth theory, that the Earth was created 4,000 years ago, or to hire a climate change denier, or conversely, it's not a violation of academic freedom to insist on only hiring climate change deniers. Departments, universities, and colleges have authority to determine the intellectual content of what they teach. Institutionally, that authority tends to be delegated to departments, and it is absolutely appropriate for departments to exercise constraints on that intellectual content. There's no violation there of freedom of speech. On the contrary, that is academic freedom in a nutshell. And that also means that a faculty member can be fired or a student can be given a low grade. And of course, with enough low grades, a student could face sanctions up to and including expulsion for failing to comply with the demands of the curriculum. This is the freedom that allows, in a private sphere, a college like Ave Maria to insist on doctrinaire Catholic teaching. That same freedom applies to a public institution just as much. Well, you can see how that really contradicts free speech in the sense that a student can say, I have the freedom to express my view about the young Earth theory, and that's true. That doesn't prevent them from getting a low grade on an exam if they do. A faculty member is free to say, I have the freedom to express my view that the Holocaust never happened, and that's true, but that doesn't prevent them being fired if their history department that employs them doesn't share that view. So the whole idea of academic freedom is excluding as much as it is including free expression. If I can use an analogy from a very famous phrase, there's no point to sifting and winnowing if we don't winnow. The exercise of sifting and winnowing is precisely designed to create academic institutions in which ideas and evidences and theories and studies are brought into discussion, and then some are kept and some are excluded. That's academic freedom as an institutional right. What about academic freedom as an individual right? Well, I've already mentioned that putting constraints on, rewards and punishments on faculty for what they teach or how they research is not an infringement on their academic freedom. To give you one more example that's a little bit less obvious than the others, a biology department that chooses to focus on studying viruses and insects is perfectly free to say we are not hiring someone whose main area of study is chickens, right? Because it's not just about politically fraught messages, it's about areas of study and methodological approaches and everything else. These are matters of professional practices. What about staff? And here life gets much more complicated. Academic freedom as an institutional matter creates an umbrella that includes staff as well, as long as what's going on is the exercise of the institution's academic freedom guidelines. What happens, though, to a university staff member who wants to exercise their free speech in a way that contradicts the views of the university? Now, this is not really academic freedom. This is a pure free speech right. It actually should be down below in the next paragraph, I suppose. Sorry about that. But what we have is a very limited bit of guidance. And I should have said this at the outset. We have limited guidance on most of these questions. Public universities and colleges are an area in which free speech doctrine is remarkably underdeveloped and under-theorized. We have very little guidance from the federal courts and the US Supreme Court, from our legal history, on how even broadly conceived understandings of free speech should apply in this specific circumstance. And when I get a little further down, I think I'll be able to show you why it's so complicated to try and apply First Amendment principles in the context of higher education. But Garcetti versus Caballos was a case where the Supreme Court considered a prosecutor who was fired for publicly criticizing the actions of his office. And the rule was that there's no protection for public employees while they're speaking in their professional capacity, as opposed to when they're acting as a private citizen and speaking on a matter of public interest. So if we just took that rule and applied it, we would say for university staff, there is no protection while speaking in a professional capacity about free speech in general, just as there's no protection, for a faculty member engaged in teaching for teaching something that the university thinks is untrue. But this is a much broader principle. Now, in that opinion, Justice Kennedy talked about the possibility of an exception for the setting of higher education, but that was a description about faculty and academic freedom rather than the idea of staff in general. So the short version is, in a university, freedom of speech principles probably do not protect staff engaged in their professional duties if in the process of performing those professional duties, they depart from university policies. It does protect those same staff members outside of the work context, acting as private citizens and speaking of matters of public interest. And that's really all we know. That's as much a rule as we have. So I've already touched on this. The fact that academic freedom to be made serious has to involve limits on free speech. But let's talk about a few specific contexts in which this would arise. So one, outside expressive activities are protected. That is, it is not proper to punish a student or a faculty member or a staff member for expression that takes place outside of work. Say a TA who puts up an offensive Facebook post. That's protected expression. If the university tries to sanction that person, they're out of line. They're exceeding their First Amendment authority. And as staff, you need to know and be sensitive to that fact. If you see, in particular, in the context of a student disciplinary activity, a student being disciplined for expression that is outside the scope of the activities of the university, that's wrong. The problem, of course, is what is outside the scope of the activities of a university when it's a place where people live. Students, residential students in particular, for 4 years will live out their entire lives in the context of a university setting. So what counts as within or outside the university context? I'll come back to that in a moment. But the principle is a sound one, and it applies much more easily to, for example, TAs or otherwise employed students. What about students who are offended by teaching? Let's say an instructor says offensive things or complain about the content of teaching. I wish we didn't teach this particular theory. That's too bad for them. That is, that's exactly the place where academic freedom trumps principles of free expression that might otherwise be in play, and students do not have the prerogative of interrupting class to express the fact that they are offended, or even necessarily to go and see the professor and express their sense of offense. Those are decisions left to faculty members and departments, limited by the commitments of professional practice. It is not good professional practice for faculty to insult students. Departments would be completely within their rights to say this is bad teaching and to sanction the faculty member who engages in that conduct. But it is not the case that students necessarily have any right, unless this is part of a university policy, to use their sense of offense about either the manner or the content of teaching and make that into a matter for university administration to have to deal with. Well, what are the legal principles underlying all this? And maybe this will help clarify both kind of the ideas, the rules that I'm describing, and why they're so complicated in the context of higher education. And basically the answer is this. Free speech does not mean you can say whatever you want. And no one has ever thought that it did. To give you a really easy example, no one has ever had a theory that says that the First Amendment protects my right to say, give me your wallet or I'll shoot you. And that's just one of dozens of categories of expression that are not protected. Think blackmail, libel, treason, intellectual property infringement. There are two basic kinds of restrictions on free speech rights. And to be fair, even though I just finished saying no one's ever thought of free speech as an absolute right, which is true because no rights are absolute, it is the case that the American constitutional system takes a relatively libertarian approach to freedom of speech. So our starting assumption is that if someone is expressing themselves, they're probably protected. And then we say, what are the limitations to that principle? And there are two broad sets of limitations, context and content. Context is described by what are called forums: public forums, private forums, and limited forums. So a public forum is a street corner, or the quad in the center of the university that everybody crosses. At least there could be, that's actually a debatable case. Or the steps in front of the Capitol. These are traditional areas in which people engage in free expression, and they are the areas in which there is the least justification for restricting that expression. In fact, the only permissible rules in a public forum are what are called content-neutral time, place, and manner restrictions, like a noise ordinance. So content-neutral means you cannot say it's okay to hold rallies in support of the football team, but not to hold political rallies. Or it's okay to hold political rallies, but not to hold social events. In a public forum, the space has to be available on the same terms to everyone. And the only kind of restrictions you can have to be things about, as I said, time, place, and manner. Those rules cannot be aimed at suppressing expression. Now here, I don't mean content like don't talk about politics. I mean, they can't be rules designed to prevent people from gathering to express themselves at all. A rule that said more than 3 people may not gather on a street corner holding signs, that would not be a valid content neutral time, place, and manner restriction. On the other hand, a rule saying no one may block a sidewalk, that would be a valid rule. Here's one that colleges wrestle with. If you close off a public area or impose time, place, and manner restrictions in a public area, there have to be adequate alternative channels for expression. Some colleges have experimented with what are called free speech zones. They've said, okay, here's one small area in one particular location, and students may engage in free speech and protest there, but not everywhere else. This is almost certainly unconstitutional, and at a minimum, it's contrary to basic free expression principles that colleges really ought to stand for as a matter of principle and philosophy. There have to be, and there should be, adequate channels for expression by students, in particular by students, to express themselves in public forums areas. So applying this to student protests, a rule banning student protests or restricting the content or topic of student protests would be unconstitutional. A rule stating that student protests may not prevent access to a building or disrupt an event are perfectly constitutional, and in fact are elements of protecting free speech. Free speech that is not regulated becomes the tyranny of the loud. That's not a better solution or a better outcome than the tyranny of the state. One needs restrictions and protective rules to ensure that different voices can be heard. And that really is fundamentally the justification that should be applied to any question about whether a rule affecting student expression in public areas, public forums, is constitutional or not. A private forum is my living room. And basically, unless I'm engaged in criminal activity, like a criminal conspiracy or drug dealing or child pornography, there's just no place for the government to restrict what is said and not said. I am perfectly free to kick somebody out of my living room if I don't like their politics, for that matter, for any reason. It's my living room. That's what it means. Then we get to a limited forum. Now, a limited forum is the most complicated and also the one that probably has the most implications for a college or university. A limited forum is a space created by the government in order to facilitate private expression. What does that mean? I'll give you an easy example. The city council is considering building a new park. They open up their proceedings for commentary by members of the public to talk about whether it's a good idea to build this new park. What are the limits that are allowed on public participation in that meeting? Well, the short answer is that reasonable content restrictions are okay. That is, if this is a meeting about whether to build a new park, that doesn't mean you're entitled to grab the microphone and talk about the Packers or Donald Trump's presidency or any other topic that isn't about the park. This is a forum open for a limited purpose, and the limited purpose in my example is talking about whether the city you live in should build a new park, and that's it. And it's perfectly okay to limit the subject matter of discussion to that content. It is not okay to limit the subject matter of that content by its viewpoint, to say you may only speak in favor of the proposed park, not against it. Well, you're probably already jumping ahead to see where this is going, but what's a classroom? What kind of forum is a classroom? What kind of forum is your office or a faculty member's office? What kind of forum are the hallways that the offices come off of, or the interior of a dorm room, or the public spaces in a dorm, right? It's really easy to look at a street corner and say, this is a public forum. It's plausible to look at a public space at a public university, like a big quad or a big open mall area, and say, that's a kind of a limited forum. Although even there, you could restrict its use to, say, students or university affiliated persons. But a university encompasses all these different forums. The inside of a dorm room is presumably a private space, particularly if we think of the students as renting those dorms from the university, in which case it's a landlord-tenant relationship. But the inside of a classroom is clearly not. Obviously, content restrictions, the kind that are appropriate to a limited forum, but not to a public forum, are entirely appropriate in a classroom. There's no obligation that students carry on about the Packers or the Trump presidency in a chemistry class. It's simply irrelevant. What about viewpoint restrictions? Well, as I mentioned earlier, in a certain sense, at least, the whole idea of academic freedom has to do with the authority of appropriate actors to determine what are correct and incorrect understandings, and that gets really close to a viewpoint restriction. There's the old cartoon of the kids saying 2 + 2 = 5 in my culture, right? That's a joke. I think it was a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon, but it stretches out to other things, and that those issues about the distinction between viewpoint and content arise not only in the natural sciences, but of course, obviously, in the social sciences and the humanities. And there has to be the ability for academic actors, for administrators, for professors, for departments, for curriculum designers to determine what is and is not acceptable argumentative content in an instructional setting. So in the instructional setting, that's the purest location which academic freedom trumps freedom of speech. On the other hand, public areas of dormitories are a much more complicated area, as are hallways of offices, and for that matter, your offices and mine. The best answer that I can give you is it is almost certainly appropriate to treat our offices as private forums, but when we are engaged in our jobs, that is, when we're engaged in professional activities in those offices, we're bound by those free speech limitations that apply to public employees. In other words, it's perfectly okay when I'm in my office for me to say to a student or a fellow faculty member or whomever happens to come into my office, I think that is wrong. I would rather not have discussed this topic. This is not what these office hours are for. The complaint you're making is not one that our office has a solution for. Any of those are perfectly valid modes of things to say and ways to restrict expression that takes place in your office. It is not okay when you're engaged in your professional activities to say, I find what you're saying an unwelcome idea and I won't let you express it. But that is not really a legal rule. You'll notice I'm playing with different legal rules and trying to put them together to get at something. We have the rules about public employees, we have the rules about different kinds of forum, and I'm trying to weave these things together to describe what goes on in my office and in your office. And the short answer is nobody knows. There is no clear rule on that question. So my best advice is to think of it as a public activity or a public professional activity taking place inside a limited forum. And if that's unhelpful, if you think that's unhelpful, I don't disagree. I think the best answer is to come back to the fact that this is not really a free speech issue at all. It's a matter of good professional practice. It's not good professional practice for a teacher, an instructor in a classroom to insult students. Similarly, there are good and bad professional practices in all the work that we do. And I think those are much, much better guides to what's appropriate and inappropriate than any kind of theory of free speech. Well, you'll notice a reference here in the notes to physical and metaphysical forums. This is where university council earn their money, or don't. Please don't repeat that comment. Because I said that a limited forum is a space that is created by the government in order to allow private expression. That turns out to apply not only to a building or a meeting, but even to a pool of money, like a funding pool for inviting speakers. And of course, these are some of the most common controversies. There's a short answer and a long answer, and I'll give you just the short answer, even though I know that you will find it unsatisfying, and you'll be right. The short answer goes like this. If the university is the one doing the inviting, if the university is the one appointing the instructor, if the university is the one presenting the speaker, then the university is perfectly free to express any viewpoint it wants and to limit that viewpoint any way that it wants. This is not specific to universities. This is a general principle about government speech. The government is perfectly free to express a particular viewpoint as long as it's not about religion. To use the example from a famous case, just because the US government gives money to something called the Fund for Democracy does not mean they are required to give money to the Fund for Fascism or the Fund for Communism. It's perfectly legitimate for the University of Wisconsin, either as a system or a particular branch, to take a position that racism is bad or that we should honor the Native Americans who occupied these territories before we took them, as was done in this meeting, or to express any other political viewpoint limited only by the Establishment Clause of the Constitution having to do with religion. Where the government or the university is not the one doing the speaking or the inviting, then you have that limited forum idea. You can have restrictions of content, but not viewpoint. And that arises whenever, excuse me, my apologies. I live with cats to whom I am mildly allergic. It's attention. That idea applies to things like segregated fees, systems of funding which are controlled by students or student groups, provided by the university, but controlled by, or in the case of seg fees, funded separately, but controlled by private actors. In those situations, the university may not impose rules limiting content or viewpoint, or certainly not viewpoint. They may have rules about content, although those tend to be rules about what kind of organizations can receive the funding in the first place. But once you've created a pool of money and made it available to students or other private actors to invite speakers, the university is no longer the one speaking and no longer has the authority to impose any restrictions on viewpoint, even highly provocative viewpoints. Now, there's one obvious solution here if you're a university. Stop giving funds to students. Simply make all invitations for speakers something controlled directly by the university. Insist that all student groups have permission from the university before engaging in any invitation of speakers or publication of materials. One could do that. That does solve the legal problem. It does so at a cost. The cost of the kind of independent activities by students in pursuing ideas and expression that we want to foster, that we think is a good element of a higher educational environment. And so there is this tension. And this is the tension all along between free expression and academic freedom. But to the extent the legal rules are of any help here, what they say is if the university is the one either speaking or inviting a speaker, there are no limits on what the university may do in terms of restricting the viewpoint that is expressed. If, on the other hand, the university is making resources available for student groups or for individual students or for other private actors to invite speakers, then the university's rules about the use of that funding have to be viewpoint neutral. The big thing to keep in mind, I know this is getting technical and complicated. The big thing to keep in mind is the idea of content neutrality and viewpoint neutrality. It is okay in a limited forum situation that is not a street corner or the steps of the Capitol, not the most public areas. It is okay for a university to limit the content of what is discussed as long as those restrictions are consistent with the university's mission and are reasonable. It is never okay, or almost never okay, unless the university itself is the one speaking, to have restrictions on viewpoint. If you keep the content versus viewpoint distinction strongly in mind and are just very careful, hyper careful to avoid what might be construed as viewpoint discrimination, you're probably safe. However, all of that discussion presupposed that we were talking about expression that's part of free speech in the first place. And it turns out not all speech is free speech. I used the example before of give me your wallet or I'll shoot you. And as I said, no one has ever suggested that that's protected by the freedom of speech. Here's a quotation from a famous case from 1942. There are certain well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which have never been thought to raise any constitutional problems. These include the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and the insulting or fighting words, those which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. All right, so there's this 1942 standard, which is an awfully long time ago, that says there are recognized categories of unprotected speech. And they list a few of them: obscenity, libel, fighting words. That principle was refined in 1992 in a Supreme Court case that said even when you are restricting unprotected categories of speech, you have to do so in a way that does not result in viewpoint discrimination. There is that extreme caution to avoid viewpoint issues. You cannot say, for example, no one may use obscenity in criticizing President Trump. Right? If you allow the use of obscenity in supporting President Trump, that's a viewpoint discrimination, or of course, vice versa. So what do we have from all this that helps us in thinking about the kinds of controversies that arise on universities? Well, there are recognized categories of unprotected speech. Check. For each one of these categories, there are complex legal tests that we are not going to dive into in most cases. But let's just understand that they exist. And so if we want to ban, for example, obscenity, we'll need to check with appropriate authorities to make sure that we're acting within the legal definition of that unprotected category. Same goes for libel, same goes for other things. The two categories that arise most often in the context of a college campus are fighting words and incitement. And those deserve a little more exploration. So the idea of fighting words is that there are modes of expression that would be expected to cause an average person to punch you in the nose. I can't give it a more technical definition than that. There is no First Amendment right to engage in that kind of provocation, speech that is calculated or reasonably expected to result in violence. And if you think about it, a lot of the kind of provocations that occur on college campuses, the deliberate attempts to incite free speech issues might fall into these fighting words category. They might be found to be deliberate attempts to provoke violence or expression that has a reasonable expectation of provoking violence, and universities are free to regulate that expression. I'll come back to that when I get to the strategic section of this discussion, because just because that liberty for universities exists in principle doesn't mean it's easy to apply in practice. But provocation, if it falls within the definition of fighting words, can be banned. So can incitement. Now, provocation and incitement are two sides of the same coin. Provocation means I'm saying things that make you want to engage in violence against me. Incitement means I'm trying to persuade you to engage in imminent lawless action, that's the test, that I'm encouraging. Expression that is expected to result in imminent lawless action is not protected by the First Amendment. These two broad categories give universities very powerful tools for maintaining the kind of peaceful and civil environment for learning and exchange of ideas that we all want to see preserved. A great deal of the kind of expression that causes the most trouble and the most problems for universities can be fit under a well-crafted set of regulations that focus on fighting words and incitement. The problem is that in the popular understanding, there are other categories. People think that there are unprotected categories which do not in fact exist. For example, there is no such thing as an unprotected category called offensive speech. There are technical tests for obscenity that include offensiveness, but there's no generic rule that just because speech is offensive, it can be banned. There is no unprotected category called hate speech. This is one that an awful lot of people seem to think is recognized. An awful lot of people seem to think we can ban hate speech. And first of all, the question becomes, what is that exactly? But secondly, the answer is no, that is not an unprotected category. A lot of what we call hate speech falls under the fighting words, the incitement, or the threat category, all of which are unprotected categories. But in dealing with hate speech, whether it's a matter of drafting a regulation or applying a regulation or dealing with a complaint, one has to be very careful to make sure to distinguish between those aspects of hate speech that are unprotected by the First Amendment and those that are protected by the First Amendment. And the answer is we start with that libertarian assumption that all speech is protected. We then carve out exceptions to that rule. The names of three of those exceptions are fighting words, incitement, and threats, and some others that I'll get to. Unless the expression we're talking about fits one of those categories, it is not proper for a public university to make that expression the subject of discipline. Anything that is mere advocacy as opposed to incitement is protected, right? The idea of incitement as one of these unprotected categories is, as I mentioned, that it is likely to result in imminent lawless action. Advocating lawless action in the abstract is completely protected. And that is true whether it's lawless action against the government or lawless action against private individuals or lawless action of any other kind. If there isn't a genuine likelihood that the result of the incitement will be, that the result of the speech will be imminent lawless action, then we're in the mere advocacy category, which is protected. All right, again, these are rules that are complicated. There are lots of them. I've already mentioned they have lots of technical features. How do you turn these rules, these working concepts into strategies? Then here we can finally get down to some discussion that for many of you might be more useful and more interesting than all this background. I should apologize in advance if some of this has seemed so technical or so abstract as not to be interesting. I don't actually think there's a way to get to the strategic considerations without first going through some of that theoretical background.
Excuse me,
So
I just wanted to let you know it's about 10 a.m. So
Yep.
we still have just keeping track for time for questions and then for you
Right.
being able to finish what you'd like.
Yes, please. We did start a little bit late, for whatever that's worth.
Of course. Yep. So we'll go on your schedule. Just wanted to let you know of the time.
Okay. Well, I do want to open the floor for questions and discussion. And of course, I want to keep the rest of the program on track rather than starting off with running late. So let me do this next part in very brief. And here's the key, and it's the part in italics under A, drafting. When drafting a policy, don't be creative. And the same goes when applying a policy. Don't be creative. Use the language and the standards that have been provided by the courts. Go to these key quotations from these key cases and simply use that language. So if you have a situation where there's a rule about kinds of expression that we want to restrict on campus, make sure the rule applies to things that have been recognized as hate speech or incitement, rather than trying to push the boundaries into new areas. And the case I provided you from 1991 from Wisconsin Federal Court involved University of UW Milwaukee. They actually got 3 law professors to help them draft the policy. I know at least one of them. And they drafted a policy that failed constitutional review. And you can ask, how is that possible? How could law professors draft a policy that fails constitutional review? And again, I want to go a little bit quickly here, but look at the 3 pieces of this policy that are printed. Racist or discriminatory comments, comments that demean the race, sex, religion, color, creed, etc. of an individual, or that create an intimidating, hostile, or demeaning environment for education. As I've suggested, what you want to do is make sure that each of these rules fits into a recognized category. Does racist or discriminatory comments fit into a recognized category? And the answer is no. That is not that goes beyond the technical definition of fighting words, because it is not the case that you reasonably expect any racist or discriminatory comment to result in your getting punched in the nose, which is what the judge found in the case. It's not incitement to imminent lawless action, and it's not a threat. What about the second one, demeaning the race, sex, religion, etc. of an individual or individuals, including age, national origin, ancestry? Same problem. And I'll quote the judge. Since the elements of the UW rule do not require the regulated speech by its very utterance tend to incite violent reaction, the rule goes beyond the present scope of the fighting words doctrine. So if you're writing rules of this kind, and you want to include something that we would think of as a ban on hate speech, make sure you write that rule in a way that uses the terms that describe fighting words, incitement, or threat. To try and broaden this conception to anything that is, quote, demeaning or, quote, racist goes beyond what's permissible in the regulation of expression. But it's that number 1 sub 2 I really want to focus on. Because one of the areas, and this is where I'll stop, so there'll be time for discussion. One of the really important areas that is a recognized category of unprotected speech is harassment. It is absolutely permissible to have rules that prevent harassment, sexual or otherwise. That created now the ruling these the language, these law professors use was language that creates an intimidating, hostile, or demeaning environment. The judge in the case said that standards for workplace harassment simply do not apply to students at universities. And let me say, this is simply wrong. This is the hill that is worth dying on for universities, to use an unfortunate choice of metaphor. This is the fight worth having. Enduring harassment cannot be the price of an education. It is preposterous to suggest that we say to young women going to college or minorities going to college or anyone going to college, listen, for the 4 years of college and maybe 3 years of law school or 2 years of graduate school after that, you have to endure harassment in the public places of your education that you'll be protected from once you go out into the workplace. Part of the whole argument of this discussion is that we treat college students as adults. That means they're entitled to the free speech protections of adults, but it also means they can be held to the standards of behaving as adults. And harassment, I think, is by far the most powerful legal and conceptual category for reaching that goal. But if you want to make a rule of that kind, just as in the case of hate speech, make sure you use the language provided for you, helpfully, by the Supreme Court in drafting such a rule. Harassment only is proscribable, can only be subject to discipline if it has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance or creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment. Colleges have to be able to control conduct by students, faculty, and staff to maintain an environment in which staff are able to perform their work, and faculty are able to perform their work, and students are able to study and learn. That has to be within the authority of public higher education institutions. This was a lower federal court judge, and I think he simply got it wrong. I don't know any other case in which any other judge has taken the position that the standards of workplace harassment don't apply in universities. But ultimately, all I can say is this is the fight worth having. I don't think there's any legitimate basis to try and argue that language that is simply offensive or insulting can be banned from universities. But language that has the purpose or effect of interfering with the operation of a university's mission, the mission of higher education, that is properly a matter for government intervention. And these comments about drafting obviously go equally well for the implementing of such rules. The last comment I'll make is to be sure that your procedures follow due process requirements. And that means notice and an opportunity to be heard. There have to be rules ahead of time. There have to be notice of the content of a complaint. There has to be adequate opportunities to present evidence and counter argument. And above all, there has to be strict viewpoint neutrality in both the drafting and operation of the system. But in terms of advice to administrators, if you're not sure that in either drafting a rule or applying a rule, find the kind of helpful language that I quoted here for this Meritor Savings Bank Supreme Court case and use it, rather than trying to be creative and expand the bounds of First Amendment protection. The First Amendment, properly understood, leaves higher education institutions with many resources available to protect the learning environment and to protect our students and ourselves and each other from harassment, intimidation, threats, incitement to violence, and deliberate provocations. There is no need to invite trouble in this highly polarized, highly litigation-prone era by straying into areas of protected speech and trying to restrict activities that are conducted there. I will stop now so that there's at least some time for questions and comments. I did run a bit long and we did start a little bit late, but hopefully you have found this interesting and have been provoked to have questions or complaints. Complaints especially welcome.
Thank you so very much. Yes, that was very interesting. And we do have quite a few questions to jump into here. We do have, so there was one question from Sarah going back to, I think, physical locations. And so they ask here, how are sidewalks and public and or private institutions treated? And so they've heard a number of conflicting statements on whether it's public space and, versus space in the city maintains for those sidewalks. If you could clarify that.
Sure. The short answer is it can get really complicated. You remember this story about there was a protest and the two lawyers, a man and woman, came out holding guns, and now they were speakers at the Republican National Convention, but they're also being charged. This is all in St. Louis. You remember all that? Part of what made that case complicated is it was a private gated area. And even though those were streets that cars drove on and people lived on, it was considered private property. Property distinctions are simply horribly complicated and frankly often misused. In the case, the second point is a private college is not subject to any of these First Amendment restrictions. The First Amendment only limits actions by the government. It's called the state action doctrine. You have no constitutional rights against private individuals. And students need to learn this. If students think, that they don't have enough free speech on campus to engage in, for example, racist insults, try engaging in racist insults in a law firm. You will be fired and out the door so fast, there will be a dust cloud. There's often a false narrative. Forgive me, but this is a matter of personal outrage. There's a false narrative that says that college students and faculty are delicate snowflakes, and we need to make them get used to the robust free speech of the real world. I have news for people who make that argument. In the real world, in an employment setting, people wouldn't get away with nearly the kind of outrageous expression that happens on college campuses all the time. That's a side note. I just wanted to mention it. For those of you who work at private colleges, it's very important because private colleges are not covered by the First Amendment at all. There simply is no such thing as a free speech right, which is why when people say, if Facebook doesn't put up my posts, my free speech rights are being violated, that's literally nonsense. Now, back to the question about sidewalks, which is more complicated. If it's maintained by the city and it's outside the enclosed property of the college, so imagine I just 2 months ago or less dropped my daughter off at Tufts for their first year of college, which means, by the way, I'm quite sensitive to the issues of COVID and college education at the moment. The way the Tufts campus is laid out is there's an enclosed area with dorm buildings and lawns in between and city streets that run around it. Those streets are public forums. They're maintained by the city. They're open to the public. And the easy way to tell is Tufts couldn't close them if they wanted to. If there's a sidewalk next to your college or in your college, ask yourself if your college could close it. No, we're only going to allow students, faculty, and staff to use this sidewalk. If the answer is no, it's a public forum. And err on the side of caution, because the answer is almost certainly no. I went to school at a university that had public streets running right through its campus. As long as you were on that street or that sidewalk, that was a public forum. If you stepped off, it was a private institution, so if you stepped off the sidewalk onto the campus areas, now you were no longer in a public forum. And it really is as simple as that. These situations are sometimes made complicated, sometimes deliberately. And let me say, I've been talking about trying to energize university administrations to exercise their authority. Groups like FIRE aren't wrong. Around the country, lots of administrators get this wrong and infringe on free expression rights, almost always with good intentions. I almost never find that what's going on is an evil attempt to suppress a political viewpoint, although occasionally that happens too, as for example, universities clamping down on people who criticize businesses that are big donors or alumni that are big donors. That happens. But more generally, it's just failure to be sufficiently respectful of things like public forums. So if you're not sure, if it looks like a sidewalk, it's probably a public forum. We can get complicated about this. There's actually a case about a piece of sidewalk that led to a post office, which was ruled. We can get case by case, but err absolutely on the side of thinking if it looks like a public forum, it is.
Thank you very much. I'll continue with our next question here. And now.
I'm sorry I left out the state action doctrine. I usually start with that. That's like the big point, is that there's no such thing as a First Amendment right against your employer, unless it's a public employer, and then it's messy.
I appreciate the recognition of messy and every individual response. It depends is always
the best legal argument I think I ever heard was at a big meeting last year where the regents were reconsidering tenure policy. You might recall when this was a big deal. Or year before last, we're reconsidering tenure policy. And there was so much faculty interest that we took over one of the giant lecture halls in the medical school. And there were 700 people in this giant room. And somebody got up and asked a question, basically, does this new policy mean that tenure could be abolished at any of the branches if the administration wants to? And the chief university counsel got up very slowly, walked to the microphone very slowly and said, maybe. Turned around, walked back and sat down. It was beautiful. And he was exactly right. There aren't, in an awful lot of these questions, there aren't nice, clean, determinate answers. There are attitudes that are helpful. There are guidelines. There are strategies, like use the specific language that you're given because that's been tested, right? Err on the side of always avoiding what might be called viewpoint discrimination. But nice, clear answers, if those existed, lawyers wouldn't get paid.
Well, this next question might be, we might have a little more clear cut. We'll see. So so Stephanie is wondering, how does the office extend to virtual locations that are literally our living room?
That's a great question to which there's no clear answer. I can give you my best answer, but this is not something that's been tested in the federal courts and ruled on by the Supreme Court and about what, there's none of that body of precedent and literature and discussion that builds over a period of time in a case like this. I'm in my living room right now. Nonetheless, this is not a private forum because I'm in a virtual limited forum. And by the way, this is a perfect example of a limited forum. It's open to certain members of the public to express their viewpoint, discussions on certain topics. It would be wrong for the moderators of this forum, since it's publicly funded, to say only people who support speech codes may express themselves, right? I'm physically in my living room, but that's not the point. It's the activity that I'm engaged in. And so what virtual reality has forced us to do is to recognize that the pure physical space doesn't quite work. And actually, we recognized that a long time ago when the idea was applied to a pool of money. If a pool of money can be treated as a limited forum, right, and available resources for expressing yourself, so can a chat room. So if you're online and engaged in professional activities, you should consider yourself to be the equivalent of sitting in your office. Now, as I said earlier, the rules for what goes on in your office are not perfectly clear. And again, I think we're better guided by what's good professional practice than by what's the limit of what I'm allowed to do under the First Amendment, or what's the limit of what I'm allowed to prevent other people from saying under the First Amendment. You know, there's a basic principle about free speech. It applies to all rights, but especially free speech. If everybody exercised their First Amendment rights to their limits, we couldn't have them because life would be simply intolerable. And if university administrators exercise their authority to limit expression to its absolute limit, we'd have to cut back on that authority because it would just be too unpleasant to be in a college. You know, a certain degree of forbearance and judgment is required here, and that's the professional part of our jobs. I think you're muted.
Thank you. We do have a couple more questions. And so our next one here, actually a couple of comments as well. So I'm wondering what students of color can do when you are on a campus where there is not a lot of diversity, when you have all of these restrictions. And then there's another comment.
Sure. I'm not sure what is meant in this context by all of these restrictions. Don't blockade the entrance to classrooms. By all means, if there's a funding pool available to invite speakers, invite speakers. If you'd like to see the university do more to recruit students of color, by all means, agitate for that. Hold protests, invite speakers, write petitions, ask to address administrators. You know, there's an infinite range of things you can do. And honestly, I don't see how any of them would raise First Amendment issues unless they crossed a certain line, right, that I described in the harassment context of disrupting the operation of the university. And universities have to protect themselves and have to be able to protect themselves against the disruption of the delivery of their mission. So no, it is not a legitimate exercise of free speech to interrupt a program or blockade the entrance to an event. It's perfectly an exercise of free expression to protest without blocking the entrance to that event, as is to organize a counter-protest and a counter-protest. There's an infinite regress of First Amendment protected activities. And as long as they comply with reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, they are fully protected. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I'm not exactly sure what was being asked, to be honest.
Yep, there was a follow-up comment as well. And so I think the concern and the never feeling comfortable to raise their voice. And then they felt like people would not understand because anytime that they did share their voice, that they would get shut down or people would say that they're crazy. And then this is, so just expressing some concern with that. And
we hear a lot of that actually from conservatives. There's I don't know how many of you spend a lot of time, I don't know anybody's politics, but if you listen to conservative media, which I do, you hear a lot about how conservatives on campuses feel unwelcome or feel discouraged from expressing their viewpoints because they think it won't be welcomed, right? People from different lines of the political spectrum are all feeling unwelcome. They're all feeling, oh, I might be shut down. And the only short answer I can give is, and I'm sorry, toughen up. And what I mean is there is no First Amendment right not to be made to feel unwelcome. You may have a First Amendment right to hold a rally that says white people are superior and white civilization should be protected against incursion from minorities. But you have no right not to have me walking by and say, you people are a bunch of assholes. And that's true regardless of whether you're a white supremacist or a minority rights advocate. It doesn't matter. This is viewpoint neutrality, right? That's it, right there. There is no First Amendment right to feel welcome. John Stuart Mill, the great writer about free speech, said social sanctions on unwelcome expression or undesirable expression are perfectly appropriate. It's only the government that's limited from using the power, its coercive authority to prevent that expression. And may I say, it would be a very good thing if universities and university administrators took a more eager role in expressing that viewpoint, in saying you are allowed to have this rally, but we really strongly disapprove of your viewpoint. Sure, we have, and I said this at the program I was at a few months ago, and because it got a strong reaction, I'll say it again now. Sure, if there's a student-run protest or speaker that has a viewpoint people find noxious, other students protest in response, where is the president of the university? Standing outside that the doorway to where that, let's make up a case, white supremacist is speaking and saying, as a university bound by free speech principles, we allow this speech to go forward, but let us make it clear, we as a university do not believe in this. We think this is wrong, and we teach it as false. There's nothing from a First Amendment perspective that says university administrators up to the most senior level can't take a stand on behalf of their university's viewpoint. That's that whole government speech idea. And I would very much like to see university administrations become much more aggressive in that regard, as a personal preference. In all respect, I know it's coming, but go ahead.
Yep, so there was just a response and then encouraging
Well,
folks.
I can only see part of it, unfortunately. It says, in all respect, telling us to toughen up, and that's all I can see. I presume it says is unhelpful, or is
Telling us to toughen up does not always apply. Being a person of color, you have move carefully.
Yes, that's absolutely, look, I'm only here to talk about the First Amendment concerns and free speech concerns. There's a whole different set of questions about what are effective social and political strategies. There's another comment, they're coming in too fast. I can only read the first 5 words is the problem. Just standing up alone can get you killed.
Can get you killed. Mm-hmm.
Sure. And of course, the person who commits that killing is committing the crime, right? I can only address so much in one discussion. I'm talking about the authority of the university to act under First Amendment principles. Excuse me. If you want to know the biggest threat, in my view, to a robust free political expression, it's open carry laws. People carrying around guns is not something that encourages expression. It suppresses and frightens expression away. This gets us into a whole range of discussion about racial attitudes, the inadequacies of gun control laws, the inequitable application of criminal laws, the failure of civil authorities to provide adequate protection, right? Obviously, it is the absolute obligation of a university to protect its members against violence, whether that violence is a matter of suppressing a viewpoint or not. Equally obviously, saying that doesn't make it safe. And there's nothing that I can say in the context of a First Amendment discussion that adequately addresses the question of how can students of color or staff members or faculty of color or anybody else for that matter respond to the perceived reality. And let me say, these days, a lot of conservatives I run into are running around saying, oh, if I express myself, Antifa will come and burn down my house, which is nonsense. There are no such cases, but that fear mongering is being peddled. And from a First Amendment perspective, there is no good answer. That has to be addressed in other ways, having to do with much deeper and larger phenomena.
I apologize. There's a truck outside of my door right now. So I don't know if you can hear that distraction, but I do have another question for the group that might support the last comments as well. And so they say, if we cannot utilize formal misconduct processes to confront discriminatory actions or language that do not rise to the level of formal conduct violations, what are some other actions we can take to make our underrepresented groups feel more included and welcome on our campuses?
That's a great question. I sort of started to address this already, but I think that's really the appropriate question for people, excuse me, university administrators. And the answer, my first answer is loud, frequent, public, and vigorous statements of universities' strong rejection of the kind of attitudes and expression that we're talking about. Just because we can't punish it as government actors doesn't mean we have to tolerate or express approval of it. Maybe we can, and remember, if we're talking about statements or actions by a faculty member or a staff member, they can be fired, right? Because even though it may not rise to the level of formal misconduct, it has to do with professional practices. A university is absolutely perfectly free to say that a faculty member who's engaged in, let's say, racist speech is not living up to his or her professional obligations and fire them. Even in the case of a tenured faculty member, I sit on reviewing committees that review complaints against tenured faculty, which let me tell you is loads of fun. If you really want to see the inside working of the machine. And there's no question that that would be a case we would take very, very seriously. And I need to have specific facts to make any kind of statement. But so first of all, don't underestimate the authority of the university to respond to these things as long as faculty and staff are involved. And as far as students are involved, the short answer is, and I'll say it again, loud, repeated, and vigorous public expressions of the university's viewpoints on the activities, excuse me. I see a question about limiting diversity trainings, etc. Right? That's not a free speech issue. That is, remember, the university is free to express any message it wants. That includes having diversity training and not having diversity training. It is not an infringement on free speech to require TAs to have diversity training, which is an issue that was brought up in court just a year ago. Similarly, it is not a restriction of free speech for the university to decide not to have diversity training. These are matters left to the institution as a matter of academic freedom. the ability to shape the environment in which education takes place. And always, always keep in mind, if you're contemplating one of these questions, what will it look like if I flip it around? So if you were to argue that it violates somehow some principle of free speech not to have diversity training, recognize you'd then be stuck saying it might equally violate free speech to have diversity training. It is called compelled expression, and you can't compel people to express things. Right? Both, I think, are false, because both, I think, fall under the performance of professional conduct stuff that universities, like any other employer or any other business, have control over. And the fact that they're a public institution doesn't change that. So I got a good one here from, if you don't mind, I just want to grab this one.
Please do. We do have time at this point. Our case study will start at 10:30, but that's for a smaller group of participants. And our next formal session does start at 11 o'clock with a separate link. So we do have time.
Discussing your questions. If a university were to include racist, sex, this is from Brittany Magredi. I apologize for, I'm sure, mispronouncing your name. If a university were to include racist, sexist, ableist, etc., speech as a student conduct violation, would they be in their right to do so? And the answer is no, unless it fits into one of the recognized categories of unprotected speech. Right? This is what went wrong. This is what goes wrong when you try to be creative. There isn't a recognized category of hate speech as unprotected speech. There isn't a recognized category of insulting speech as unprotected speech. The disciplinary code has to specify that it applies only to things that constitute fighting words, incitement, threats, or harassment. And that's what I meant about making use of the language that's provided in Supreme Court cases that have already been established and not being creative, because I would absolutely love to say that in our educational environment, racist, sexist, ableist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, and transphobic speech is not welcome and should not be allowed. And I'm happy to say that very loudly and frequently and vigorously, but as a state actor to punish it, I have to establish that my rules only apply to recognized categories of unprotected speech, and that in applying those rules, I'm only punishing people for engaging in what is a recognized category of unprotected speech. It's very formalistic, it's very legalistic. That's what happens when you get into legal questions.
We did miss a question from earlier we can circle back to.
Please go ahead.
And so prior to the start of the academic year, we instituted a res hall policy restricting any displays of flags or messaging in the resident hall windows. How do you believe the student's public-facing window is viewed as a public space or free speech area?
Right. I think that rule is, I like the rule, but I think it's wrong. And the reason is the dorm room itself is a private space. They rent it from the university. They're just like a tenant in a building. And a landlord could not tell me, you may not put a political, well, actually a landlord probably could because they're a private actor. The government cannot tell me, do not put a political message in my private space just because people outside can see it. Now, that would be different if I were broadcasting something with a microphone. A content neutral noise ordinance would be fine. You might be able to have a rule that says no one can post anything in their windows that can be seen from the outside. That seems kind of draconian, but that would be content neutral. The problem is when you specify flags or political messages, right? That's a content restriction. So if a dorm room is, as I'm suggesting, a private space, it's none of the government's business at all. If it's not quite a private space, but it's some sort of, I don't know what even to call it, some sort of public space maintained by, because it's maintained by the university, then rules have to be content neutral. There are actually cases about this having to do with like military bases and properties owned and operated by the governments. Those cases tend to turn on a very, very weak, excuse me, standard of reasonableness. Is it reasonable to have this restriction as part of the operational facility? So if you didn't want to accept the argument that dorm rooms are private spaces, as I think they should be, because I think students should be treated as adults, but if you don't like that approach, or if a court didn't like that approach, the likely alternative approach would be to say this is government-owned property, and we're going to ask, is the restriction a reasonable one? And almost certainly any kind of reasonable restriction of that kind would have to be content neutral.
Please, either at this point in time, if we have any other questions, or did I miss any questions at all?
Let me see.
I think we covered them.
Right, so I see some more comments about feeling comfortable. That's an important issue, but it's not a First Amendment issue. It's an important issue. Let me circle back to that, if I might. It is absolutely a proper, important, legitimate, critical role for university administrations to try and make an environment that is comfortable for all students and is welcoming for all students, in which students do feel free to express their opinions and articulate their identities. My role here today is to describe the limits the First Amendment imposes on that process, right? But that's, in describing those limits, within those limits, universities are absolutely free and encouraged to act as far as they care to. I did talk about forbearance before, and that's true. I don't think universities should push their powers to their draconian limits, but nothing in what I'm saying should be understood to suggest that the First Amendment requires or even philosophically encourages universities to refrain from creating welcoming environments and discouraging unwelcoming conduct, especially by faculty and staff who can simply be dismissed, but also by students and outsiders. Okay, I guess that's it. My email address is available if people want to send me questions in the future. I'm happy to discuss them. Thank you very much for having me. I know I didn't answer every question to people's satisfaction. I used the cop-out. That's not part of my topic today, but that's an important cop-out because, it's the content restriction that I get to impose on this particular process. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schweber. We really appreciate you being with us today. Wonderful to hear some of the things that I think we have heard before, but in a different way, and just some good reminders. So we are just really appreciative of you being here, and maybe with your cop-out, we can invite you to talk about some of those other topics later.
Very happy to do so.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I wanted to just let you all know that our next session starts at 11 a.m. Sorry, Lissa, if you were going to do this. The one thing I wanted to mention is that session is about stress management. I think all of us could use that right now. Even though it's focused on our students, I think we could also probably learn a thing or two. But I also want to especially invite you to the 12 o'clock business meeting. This is not just for WCPA executive board members or people who are just curious. We would really appreciate you all coming, because one of the really great things we're doing is we're recognizing some great colleagues and programs with awards. So if you could be there in support to do the virtual clapping and recognizing those efforts, again, I think we all need to celebrate a little bit. So please join us for that.
Perfect. And so I also just dropped something in the chat as well. If you do have any questions or connectivity issues or concerns throughout your participation with the conference, that we do have a WCPA conference@gmail.com email available where folks are monitoring that and being able to assist with that. And so just wanting to plug that as well as a support tool throughout the conference. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see your beautiful faces at the next session as Tonya promoted.